and welcome back to the Grid Podcast, your podcast about our electricity networks in Great Britain and their role at the heart of our transition to net zero, in particular getting stuff connected to them to allow that transition to electrification. It's myself, Brian Moorhead, back again hosting, and I'm also joined again by Damien.
Hello.
As introduced on the previous episode, Damien has been doing a lot of the analyst work, scripting, and all of the research behind the scenes, so we've now got him in front of camera. So for those of you who have maybe listened to the previous episode, hope you've had a bit of a break, or some of you might literally just be rolling into this one straight after. We've just had a short break, just going through our notes and taking a break between the last one. So if you have been taking a bit of a break between the last episode, just to quickly recap, we covered the current connections consultations at a high level. There's all these consultations out there at the minute, looking at all of the different things to do with connection reform. And then we touched in on the snazzily titled CMP 434, which is the kind of high-level codified structure of how connection reform will work. But obviously, as we pointed out in the last episode, there's loads of detail that sits in different documents below this. So this episode we're going to cover is the Gate 2 criteria methodology. So just to kind of recap, you have this high-level structure of how connection reform will work, but it relies on two key methodologies that sit below that. One is the Gate 2 criteria, which is basically what do I or my project, what do I need to meet to be able to get into the queue? So that's Gate 2 criteria methodology that we'll cover in this episode. In the next episode then we will cover the other important one, which is the connection network design methodology, which is, okay, you've met Gate 2 to get into the queue, but the CNDM, connection network design methodology, is all about then how NESO will mush those queues together, pull them apart, how they will order the queues, how they will actually share out and allocate that capacity. So it's actually probably the potentially more controversial methodology. Both are equally important though, to be over the detail of if you are a developer or an investor when you're looking at project risk. Which brings me in nicely to actually who's this episode relevant to. So this primarily impacts any generation application above 1 megawatt currently, or as we said in the last podcast, that 1 megawatt threshold might move to 5 megawatts. It also impacts any directly connected transmission demand projects, which is basically data centers and the very largest factories in the country. But it also demand projects connected at distribution, so pretty much everything else, which is your sheds and your typical factories and bus depots and just generally anything that needs electric, housing sites, whatever. They're technically out of scope of this, but as we'll see, it's not really that straightforward. I do think, while you're technically out of scope, and we could say, well, this episode doesn't really impact you, I do think if you're looking at a demand project, 10 megawatts or above, I think you do need a deep awareness of all of this, and you do need to be factoring it into the grid strategy for that project, for reasons that will become clearer as we get deeper into this episode and the next episode on the CNDM. We'll explain that in a minute. For any demand projects kind of less than 5 or 10 megawatts, the detail of this might well not be that applicable, but you should hopefully see an indirect impact of having capacity freed up on the grid. The one thing you will be interested in then probably is, well, when is this going to happen? For anybody in those smaller projects, the 5-10 megawatts or less, you're probably going to be more interested. Okay, well, when is this going to happen? When is this going to free up these housing sites that I've been quoted 2035 or bus depot electrification that's been quoted 2040 or whatever. So we'll aim to answer some of that as well. So I think the best thing to do is just step into it and into the Gate 2 piece. So just high level, we've kind of covered why these two policies or two methodologies is the right term, isn't it? Keep me right here, Damien. Is so important. So we'll jump into it in terms of Gate 2 methodology. It's basically comprised of two elements.
So the two criteria is land and or planning.
And that's the project readiness element. And then the other element is the strategic alignment.
So the strategic alignment is to align with the NESO's advice to government that they were commissioned for, known as CP30 or Clean Power 2030.
Okay, perfect. So basically 2 elements to get into Gate 2, project readiness, which is primarily land rights,
Yep.
but you can substitute that with planning, or there's a
Yeah, if you're going through a DCO route, you can use planning.
Let's just summarize. You can the land rights piece hasn't really changed massively, bar this bit about for DCO, development consent order, large projects. If you're involved in one of them, recommend you look into the regs in a bit of detail. But let's, for all intents and purposes, for the majority of people, the project readiness box is basically that kind of option agreement that's got a 3-year validity, and there's various different details about that. So again, recommend go consult the detail and you'll get all of that. But that bit hasn't really changed too much. The big change is really this bit about the strategic alignment piece. So it's an and criteria. You need to have the project readiness and then this be strategically aligned to what GB needs for the Clean Power 2030 system, which again, it actually is 2030/2035, which we'll touch on a bit more. And basically, Clean Power 2030, that criteria primarily applies to the generation aspect of the queue, isn't that right? And that's basically something to do with technology pots then?
Yeah, so NESO have set like technology pots on a regional basis and wider basis across GB about certain technologies, so solar, wind, and what's needed for 2035 or 2030.
Yeah, so effectively, this is all targeted at the generations. We'll touch on how demand fits into this in a second, where basically the government have said to NESO, we need to get moving, we need to get a clean power grid by 2030.
Yep.
NESO have then said, okay, well, look, here's the different technology types and how much of them we need on the grid by 2030 to meet net zero, but also demand is going to grow to 2035. So the generation you need for 2030 isn't going to be, you're going to go backwards if you just stop there. So it's also worth having an eye on 2035 as a secondary pot. So that's primarily driven at generations. That's things like quotas on solar, on batteries, on offshore wind, onshore wind, and that type of thing. Which is very interesting. So we've got graphs in front of us here. NESO have set out at a nationwide level the kind of technology pots, if you like, we'll call them pots. So basically, nationwide, how many megawatts or gigawatts of solar storage, onshore wind, offshore wind, fossil fuels, nuclear, interconnectors, and other renewables into those separate pots. Here's what we kind of need. There's basically 2 scenarios for both 2030 and 2035. And then they've looked at the current queue and they've kind of weighed it up against, here's the total current queue, here's the current queue that might be ready based on RFI responses, a bit speculative. But you can kind of clearly see, so I'm just looking at the 2030 graph, the current queue of storage, for example, looks like it might be 3 times oversupplied, if not more. Solar looks, it isn't double oversupplied, but it's quite significant. And then, but there may be areas of undersupply as well. So, offshore wind is sort of looks like, depends on what scenario you're looking at, if it's the total queue or the what would be ready queue, marginally undersupplied, probably. And even solar, based on what might meet the readiness queue based on the RFI responses, solar may well be undersupplied slightly as well once this whole filtering exercise kicks in. But then it's worth also looking. So these are in the main overview document of the NESO consultation. I think it's in around page 38 and 39. It's quite interesting. And then there's the 2035 pots, which then even, they're showing an even bigger oversupply of storage there as well, as that's where the oversupply of solar really kicks in as well. So it's quite interesting to even just reading those graphs and looking at that data to see, what technologies are oversubscribed, what are undersubscribed. But it is worth touching on that graph is just a very high level summary at a nationwide level. It doesn't necessarily translate into a regional level. So what they're proposing here is the actual pots would be set at a regional level. I can't remember actually. If you really delve into the depths of the consultation, you can find NESO's kind of draft technology allocations. They've split it up by both the 17 transmission regions that they kind of operate the transmission network on, and they've also done a piece separating it into the different DNO license areas as well. So there is some work and some data on that when you drill right into the kind of depths of the consultation documents. The one thing I would say is they kind of on the graph set the technology pots beside the kind of queue information they
Yep.
have. When you get into the regional level, the queue information there looks unreliable.
Yep.
So what I would recommend anybody, we haven't had time to do it yet, but you want to take the technology pot info and then probably go and look at other sources of queue information and do your own analysis there. And any generation developer, with it wouldn't be rocket science to give it a good stab as to where you might sit in a regional technology pot queue and sort of work out your rough odds of are you going to
Yep.
meet gate 2 or not. And it's also worth saying, probably at this stage, there's a bit of a distinction here. There's almost like gate 2 2030 and gate 2 2035.
Yep.
So when it comes to actually sorting the queue, there'll be the kind of 2030 batch where you'll be sorted and cut based on meeting the 2030 pots. Those projects will obviously get advanced, ideally with a pre-2030 date.
Yep.
And then there'll be a 2035 batch, if you like, where, well, yeah, you don't meet the 2030 pot, but that pot grows by 2035 and you do meet that pot. So you will then get an offer based on a pre-2035 date.
Another big one would be clean power is obviously advice to government. So it requires a government decision if NISO can use a 2035 pot.
That is a good point. So yes, at the minute, it's just NISO's recommendation that we also have this 2035 pot. That is all subject to government as well. Another interesting one, when NISO were asked at the customer event last week, NISO were only presenting the nationwide pot at this stage, and they were asked about, well, what about the regional pots?
Yep.
Because that's the really kind of political football one. Who decides how much solar goes where? That has big kind of you're deciding impacts on local communities, but you're also deciding things like, would you decide to set a massive solar pot in London where you'd never be able to actually find land for solar or make it impossible for developers? So that's a lot of the contentious decision making, in my opinion.
Again, NISO have said that our caps are subject to government approval. So if we've said, look, we don't need any more solar here, the government can go, well, we want solar.
Yeah. So it was funny at the event, NISO were basically saying that's all a decision for government in terms of how the regional pots pan out. But it is interesting then that you can actually find their recommendations for those regional pots in the kind of depths of the consultation as well, which is really interesting. Because ultimately it's going to be a big call for government to not take on NISO's advice as well. But at the same time, they may well have designated a zone for offshore wind where the seabed's not shallow enough or something, or they have designated a zone like London for solar that there is no land available or whatever. So there's a lot of different issues there, which will be interesting as we get more and more into the detail of this. So we haven't at this stage had time to analyse that data in a lot of detail. As you can probably tell, because some of the scenarios I thrown out are probably, once we get into the detail, probably clarified. So that is all interesting. The other thing the 2035 pot also does is for people sitting in the 2035 pot with an offer, there will be attrition in the 2030 pot. NISO have confirmed in the CNDM, the network design methodology, there is no factor for attrition. Their attrition contingency mechanism is the 2035 pot. So basically, if somebody gets a pre-2030 offer and they drop out, the contingency is to then go to the 2035 queue and say, well, is anybody here, do they want to put their hand up to be accelerated into the 2030 pot and look to pull somebody forward? So there's a term called acceleration that's in the CNDM, which we'll touch on in a bit more detail in the following episode on that. So just to recap what all we've covered, actually, since there's so much in all of this. So just to recap, Gate 2, there's two key elements: project readiness, so what you as a developer, investor, or project promoter need to do, which is largely land rights. And then also being ready to meet the tight milestones on things like planning and design and everything else. And then this strategic alignment piece. So strategic alignment is defined as meeting one of three criteria. So the first one is the technology pots, which basically impacts all generation projects. Some demand projects might be in the CP 2030 technology quotas, An example might be hydrogen electrolyzers. NESO's remit now includes all forms of energy, so the remit also involves strategically planning hydrogen supply. So but largely speaking, alignment to CP 2030 is probably just going to largely generation. And at this point, we don't have any indication that normal demand projects, data centers, the large factories, and anything like that is going to be in scope with those kind of quotas or pots.
Yeah, if you're a directly connected transmission demand, you get a buy on the strategic alignment.
Yeah, so that's going back to the kind of the three things. There's a strategic alignment, doesn't really apply to demand. Then there is basically being outside of scope of CP 2030, which is then basically anything else, so demand or whatever. And then there's also a third criteria, a third way in, if you like, and that's the project designation, which we've touched on a couple of times in the last podcast as well. And that's a separate methodology. Again, quite a contentious issue. But we'll touch on that methodology in a separate podcast as well as to how you might meet that. But that's all about being critical for system security of supply, and different bits and bobs. But we'll get into that later. It's a more niche area, to be honest. It's not going to be for the vast majority of projects. So I'm just double checking our notes here to make sure we have covered everything. There is no pots for demand. We've covered that. Transmission demand is all about meeting the readiness. As mentioned before, embedded demand is still out of scope, apparently, of all of this. So none of this applies to embedded demand, but it does apply to distribution connected generation, just to clarify that. And yeah, I think we've actually covered it pretty well there. It is interesting. I do recommend having a look at the consultation documents, looking at those charts and pots. As I say, you should be able to work out, roughly speaking, where you might fall into one of those 17 regional pots. But also worth noting that those are very much just draft advice to government as well, and those pots might well change. It'll be interesting to see how industry picks up on the pots and responds on those in the consultation actually as well. There's a lot of talk around investor certainty and everything here. So obviously a lot of kind of critics of the process and everybody else will say, well, look, there's so much investor uncertainty here. We really need to get a better system that allows us to bring investment in and power this kind of green transition. I do think the setting out of the pots, now I've made the point about how you set the pots is quite a contentious issue. I'm not quite sure on the solution in that or whatever else, but having those kind of clear pots and clear signals does set a level of uncertainty. You know, if you think about it up until this point, the only certainty you kind of have investing in renewable projects is that, well, if you're in that mix of that queue and haven't had firmed up dates, all you know is there's going to be a lot of attrition coming and projects, you know, getting massively long dates. That, you know, that's not good for anybody. Whereas these pots do set a level of certainty that gives you a good signal. Different people will have different opinions there. That's just a very engineering view of it, I suppose. But ultimately, there was always going to come a point where this overinflated queue was going to have to be cut down or reprioritized in some shape or form. So again, we'll be interested to see what wider industry's reaction to it is. You know, ultimately, we're not a project developer. We work with developers across all the different sectors. So we'll continue to just take views from all the different clients we would work with as well.
As part of NESO's goal to be a wee bit more transparent as well, they will publish the outcome of the Gate 2 queue. So the new queue, once the strategic alignment is done, they'll publish that. And they'll also publish how many applications they checked. So at the minute, they aim to check up to 100%, but they're going to publish that to be more transparent.
So that's in terms of how when they verify that people are ready. They're aiming to vet them all.
All you have to do is you have to sign a letter as a director saying, I declare I'm ready for Gate 2. But NESO will then check up to 100% if you're telling the truth.
Because that was an issue previously, because they were kind of saying it would be self-certification, weren't they?
It's now called a readiness declaration.
Yes. So they were previously saying, as long as somebody signed a letter to say, yeah, we definitely meet all this. They were being a bit ambiguous on, well, people were saying, well, we want this policed, like we want the rules to apply to everybody.
So it has to be signed by a director, and that will be checked through Companies House.
So NESO aren't guaranteeing they're going to check everything. They're saying they might, but they will publish data on.
And if you're an embedded generator, your DNO has to check it and not NESO.
Yes. And that is one thing we didn't touch on in the previous podcast. We touched on a lot of the consultations at the minute. We touched on a couple of the extra bits of documents that are due out. Going back to that point around who might this podcast be before or who might find it interesting, we're expecting to see a lot of ENA consultation and documentation come out over the next few months now. The high level kind of structure or framework is starting to come together at transmission level. There's going to be loads of stuff now for the DNOs and the ENA to put in place around how things work at the lower, lower voltages, so the distribution level. And we're going to come to it in the next episode on the connection network design methodology around this whole issue of embedded demand being out of scope, how it fits into the queue. Can it queue jump?
Yep.
Is it going to be disadvantaged? Queue jump's probably the wrong term, but anyway. And a lot of stuff around how the DNOs interact and feed the generation queue into this as well. But just to recap and wrap up on Gate 2 really, you've got the two key high-level elements. You've got your project readiness, which is basically land rights, or there's some other stuff in there for DCO projects. And then you've got this strategic alignment piece, which basically, for generation, you have to align to one of these regional technology pots or quotas. And for demand, doesn't really matter too much. Although it is worth saying there is a danger or a risk that government might well put certain demand quotas into the CP 2030 plan, which we haven't heard any noise of yet. But for example, they could well decide, there's a massive issue of demand capacity growth that's going to threaten our objective of getting to clean power, and we want to limit that by 2030. Haven't heard any word of it.
So that's one of the worries with the power or the generation pots, is if demand overgrows their forecast, then they'll have to review the pot earlier than they thought.
Which is another point. So the generation pots may well change based on how demand on the network flexes as well. And there's been no talk of them putting out signals to increase demand levels to...
Yeah, so there's a signal if they're undersupplied in generation, they'll say we need this type of generation, but there's no input there that says that, well, if we need more demand, we'll send a signal.
So there's a lot of different nuances in all of this. As I say, we've wanted to try and cover this in something bite-size. This is going to be a blitz of different podcasts to try and cover the detail, point you to kind of where the detail sits. But we're never going to get into every minutiae. So I think we'll probably leave it there. I think we've covered Gate 2 relatively well. Hasn't changed, project readiness hasn't changed a whole lot from what was there previous. It's this alignment and technology piece, which is the big one. And we'll be coming back to that in the CNDM podcast when we get into more of the detail of how this actually works. It might end up being 2 podcasts anyway, because that's actually, the CNDM is probably the biggest topic in all of this, and probably the one with the most interesting detail. So we'll wrap up there. Thanks for listening. As I say, you can get your podcasts from us, Spotify, Apple still do podcasts? I think they do. YouTube,
I'm a Google person.
Yeah, wherever you get your podcasts. I think it was Google discontinued podcasts. And we'll be back shortly then with getting into the connection network design methodology, which kind of sets how all this queue gets formed and works. All right, thanks.